851. Go ahead and disregard the checks. We got him at San Jacinto Pacific. Out there.
An ex-convict was suspected of a brutal double homicide because his driver's license was found at the scene. In the past, this might have been enough for a conviction, but a dish of ice cream pointed investigators in a different direction. On the day before Thanksgiving in 2003, a St. Petersburg, Florida shop owner noticed a Jeep near his store.
It had blood and it had all kind of things inside of it. It had a purse inside of it, and the seatbelt was hanging out, and just a lot of things you could tell it wasn't right.
The right front windshield was shattered, and we found a purse with contents and identification and money and so forth relating to the female passenger.
The Jeep belonged to Richard and Carla Van Dusen. Carla's cell phone was found on the front seat. Just a half-mile away, neighbors called police to report 2 dead bodies on the road outside their home. They were identified as Richard and Carla Van Dusen.
Richard was laying face down in the dirt of the driveway, and Carla was laying on her side. Both had been shot in the head, and we later learned through an autopsy that Carla had also been stabbed.
Richard and Carla had been married for 3 years. They had 3 grown children from previous marriages.
My son, he said, they're dead. And I said, did they have an accident? And I said, are you sure? Several times I asked him if he was sure. And then he told me that they had been found and that they had been murdered. And I don't even remember after that.
Investigators had 2 crime scenes, the Jeep and the area where the bodies were found. Based on the evidence and the location of the bodies, investigators think that the killer was someone the Van Dusens knew.
We felt that there probably was a third party involved in the vehicle with them. Richard Van Dusen is forced out of the car at gunpoint. We feel that he's certainly killed outside of the car. Carla Van Dusen is shot while seated in the car.
It looked like Carla saw what was happening, turned her head, lifted her left hand, and the bullet went through the windshield, her hand, and into her head. Later, the killer cut her seatbelt and removed her body from the Jeep. Investigators believe the killer then drove the Jeep a half-mile away and abandoned it. On the ground near the Jeep, police found a Florida driver's license. It belonged to someone named Henry Sullivan.
We learned that Mr. Sullivan had a comparatively extensive criminal arrest record, from narcotics to crimes against persons, battery and aggravated battery, probation violations. He had a reasonably extensive record.
When police went to Henry Sullivan's apartment, they found a vintage red 1971 Chevrolet Cheyenne pickup truck parked outside his apartment. Incredibly, the truck belonged to the murder victims, Richard and Carla Van Dusen.
It had been completely restored. It was a classic truck. It was a definite eye catcher, and in fact, what I would describe as one-of-a-kind pickup truck.
When questioned, Henry Sullivan denied any involvement in the murders. With his driver's license found at the crime scene, it looked like an open and shut case. But it was just the beginning. Friends and family couldn't believe that Richard and Carla Van Dusen were murdered. Richard was a copy machine sales manager whose hobby was collecting antique cars. Carla was a courtroom reporter. On weekends, she worked as a clown, entertaining sick children at local hospitals.
They were pretty well known in the community. They lived in a small beach town outside of St. Petersburg called Tierra Verde. Very beautiful sugar sand beaches.
The prime suspect was 32-year-old Henry Sullivan. He couldn't explain why his driver's license was found near the Van Duzen's abandoned Jeep and insisted he was innocent.
Sullivan said, I lose my IDs all the time. In fact, I just lost one, a couple weeks before you came to interview me.
The driver's license was dusted for fingerprints. None were found. Police also looked for fingerprints inside the Van Duzen's Jeep, especially on the seatbelt.
After having applied an anhydrous to the seatbelt and allowing it to dry completely, I re-examined that seatbelt for the presence of fingerprints and found none.
But the killer left behind one piece of evidence, a 9mm bullet found on the floor of the victim's Jeep. When investigators searched Henry Sullivan's apartment, they found a 9mm pistol.
Investigators found that Sullivan was in possession of 2 9mm pistols, and that matched with the murder weapon that investigators had been looking for.
One was inoperable. The other 9mm handgun was test-fired into a tank of water. That bullet was microscopically compared to the 9mm slug found in the Van Duzen's Jeep. Analyst Erica Henderson carefully examined the distinctive marks called lands and grooves, made when each bullet goes through the barrel of the gun.
When you look down the barrel of a firearm, you will see the ridges and valleys. These ridges and valleys, once a bullet is fired, will be imparted on the bullet. So the bullet will also have these ridges and valleys.
The test bullet and the one from the crime scene were turned repeatedly as Henderson checked and rechecked the markings.
I just work the evidence. So I try to have tunnel vision because I don't want anybody ever to come around and say, you have a biased opinion.
But the results showed that Henry Sullivan's gun was not the murder weapon. Crime scene analysts then turned their attention to the Van Duzen's classic red pickup truck found behind Henry Sullivan's apartment. As they examined the vehicle, there was another bizarre incident in this already unusual investigation.
We are approached by a white male subject who identifies himself as William DeParvin, who announces himself to us as the owner of the truck and said that he had purchased it the day previous.
DeParvin lived in the same apartment building as Henry Sullivan, and he said he bought the truck from the Van Duzen's just the day before. He said the Van Duzen's placed an ad for the truck in the local newspaper. DeParvin went to look at the truck, bought it, and said the Van Duzen's later delivered it to his apartment. He said he paid them $6,500 for it, and when they left, he never saw them again.
His approach to us was very upfront and forward. He was quite conversational, and he didn't appear to be defensive or belligerent or anything of the sort.
Most of DeParvin's story could be corroborated, but there were several discrepancies.
What's he doing with a bill of sale for $6,500 when Van Duzen's telling a co-worker the day before he's found a buyer for $13,500? Now, that just tells us there's something not right here.
DeParvin said the Van Duzen's left his apartment around 5:30. But Carla Van Duzen called her mother at 6:37 p.m. with information that contradicted that.
The night that they were killed, I got a phone call from Carla, and she was very excited. She said, yeah, I'm in the car. I'm driving behind Rick and the guy that bought the truck because he knows where to get the paperwork done tonight.
Although Carla never mentioned the buyer's name, the call placed the buyer, presumably DeParvin, in the pickup truck with Richard Van Duzen, an hour after DeParvin said they left his apartment.
It just kind of went through my mind as to what is the hurry, that you have to go out at night to get this paperwork done.
DeParvin denied he was the man in the pickup truck with Richard Van Duzen.
Homicide, Keene speaking.
A background check revealed this wasn't DeParvine's first brush with the law.
We found that Mr. DeParvine had an extensive felony arrest record and that he had just been released from prison and was on probation.
DeParvine had just served 9 years on a weapons possession charge. And Henry Sullivan was still a suspect.
We still have the Henry Sullivan angle, and also we don't lose sight of the fact that there may be an unknown perpetrator involved in this crime. There may be something else completely unrelated to the sale of the pickup involved.
Based on DNA testing and blood spatter analysis, investigators believe Richard Van Dusen was pulled from his Jeep and shot outside the vehicle. His wife, Carla, was sitting in the passenger seat and was shot through the windshield. But on the steering wheel, investigators found blood which did not come from Carla or Richard.
The samples that were tested from the steering wheel were consistent with being human blood. Those samples were tested to develop a DNA profile.
Perhaps the killer nicked his hand while cutting the seatbelt to remove Carla's body, and the blood dripped onto the steering wheel while he drove the Jeep to the dump site. Investigators asked their initial suspect, Henry Sullivan, for a DNA sample. Testing showed it was not his blood in the car.
Sullivan wasn't involved in the crime, so the mystery was, how did his car get there?
And investigators soon had another theory for how it got there. Henry Sullivan had a brother who was stopped for a traffic violation on the night of the murders. He told police that night that his name was Henry.
We have another person using Henry Sullivan's name and date of birth. Could he be the killer and the one that's dropped the driver's license at the scene where the vehicle was found?
Justin Sullivan had a warrant in existence for his arrest, wholly unrelated to any of the matters pertaining to this case. In an attempt to evade that, he gave his brother's name. Our curiosity was piqued to the point that we thought perhaps Justin Sullivan was using Henry's identification, and it could have conceivably been that Justin dropped the ID card at the scene of the crime.
But like his brother, Justin denied any involvement in the murders. He said he had an alibi, that he was with friends at a nightclub, which they corroborated. Then, investigators asked their third suspect, William DeParvine, for a DNA sample. He said no.
We don't have any probable cause at this point in time in the investigation to indicate that Mr. DeParvine is involved in the murder. Therefore, we don't have enough information to draw a search warrant.
Without a warrant, police couldn't get a genetic sample directly from DeParvine. But there were other ways.
We were looking for him to either eat something, drink something and discard it, chew gum and discard it, or even spit so that we could swab that up.
A team of detectives was assigned to follow DeParvine everywhere he went, hoping to somehow get his DNA sample.
When someone's out on foot, like in a mall, we work in pairs of 2, so therefore if you've got 10 people, you've really only got a team of 5 following a person. And you need at least 8 to 10 people to follow somebody so that they don't know they're being followed.
DeParvine had earned a law degree while he was in prison, and he was very careful, either because he was disciplined or he knew he was being followed.
Mr. Parvine is an intelligent individual. He's not your average type of criminal.
He led a very monotonous, very bland type of lifestyle. He would get up in the morning, he would go to work, he would come back home and stay inside his little apartment and go to sleep.
DeParvine was a construction worker, and he had no social life to speak of. For months, the surveillance continued with no luck. But DeParvine made a mistake during the Christmas shopping season. He stopped at an ice cream store and bought a dessert known as a blizzard.
My partner at the time and I watched him eat the blizzard and felt that the way he was slowly eating the blizzard and taking the spoon and raking it across his teeth, that that spoon would possibly give us some DNA from Mr. DeParvine.
DeParvine discarded the cup and the spoon, and investigators immediately retrieved the spoon from the trash.
The technology has become incredibly sensitive and incredibly powerful, and there is the ability to obtain DNA from the smallest piece of evidence in a very reproducible, very reliable manner.
On the spoon, scientists found saliva. They extracted DNA and compared it to the blood found on the steering wheel of the Van Duzen's Jeep. The results left no doubt.
The DNA profile that was developed from the steering wheel was matched to the DNA profile that was obtained for William DeParvine, his known standard.
William DeParvine was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Yet he continued to maintain his innocence. He claimed his neighbor, Henry Sullivan, was the culprit and that the driver's license proved it. A jury would have to decide. William DeParvine admitted that he was with Carla and Richard Van Duzen on the night they were murdered. DeParvine says he bought the couple's truck, and after he paid for it, he never saw them again. But prosecutors didn't believe that. They say the Van Duzens delivered the car, but DeParvine didn't have the money. So he asked the Van Duzens to follow him to his friend's home to get the money. Phone records indicate Carla called her mother at 6:37 to say she was driving behind the man who bought their truck. Although no one knows why, they apparently left the pickup truck at one location, and all three got into the Jeep on their way to get the money. As DeParvine led the Van Duzens to the deserted road, they may have realized that there was no friend, that there was no money, and that this was a setup. DeParvine used a 9mm weapon to order Richard out of the Jeep and shot him. He shot Carla through the windshield. The bullet passed through her left hand as she tried to protect herself. Then DeParvine cut Carla's seatbelt to remove her body from the Jeep, and in doing so, accidentally cut his hand. His blood dripped onto the steering wheel as he drove the Jeep back to the pickup truck. Before he abandoned the Jeep, he planted Henry Sullivan's driver's license, which he may have stolen since Sullivan lived in the same apartment building as he did. To cover his tracks, DeParvine forged the bill of sale for the truck in the amount of $6,500, half of what the Van Duzens were asking for it. Where he disposed of the murder weapon remains a mystery.
He was on a work release when he killed Carla and Rick. I had been told that federal investigators had deemed him to be a psychopath, a sociopath, and I was told by one of the prosecutors that they did not think this whole crime happened because he wanted that truck. It happened because he was looking for somebody to kill.
At the trial, DeParvine insisted he was innocent and took the stand in his own defense.
As soon as Mr. DeParvine took the stand, then prosecution turned very aggressive and went after Mr. DeParvine and basically started to pull apart all of the alibis.
DeParvine told a series of stories trying to explain what happened, but none of them matched the physical evidence.
The point where I made up my mind that he must be guilty was after I heard his complete testimony and decided that all of the alibis that he was coming up with were just beyond belief.
The jury took 3 hours to find DeParvine guilty, and he was sentenced to death. In the end, some saliva on a plastic spoon and a small nick on his hand told investigators how he committed the crime and how he killed 2 innocent people who were just trying to sell their truck and be on their way.
I was never really into forensic science or even, gave it any thought. But since that time has happened, I have become hooked on court TV. And I've learned a lot about the way the law works and about the way forensics play into a case where there's no eyewitness, especially.